You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Now today, because all protocols observed, I want to especially thank Dr. Ugorji for making this happen. Muniamana for a very long time. I've always believed in this ability to pull things off by us. So I'm very happy and excited to be here and to be part of this conference. I think many people here will say, okay, well, you have a cup of wine, or you have a keynote. I have a open wine. Let me do my own citation before I start, very briefly. I'm trained as a historian. I studied at the Ugorji College of Education, Owerri, as part of the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Myself and one other colleague were the first to make the first class in history. I went on to study history. I studied women's history at the University of Bergen in Norway, where I had an MPhil in history. My thesis at Norway was among the people of southeastern Nigeria. I studied at the University of Helsinki, Finland, for another master's degree in history and North American studies. And then I studied at the University of Toronto for a PhD in African history and gender studies. That's why I do stuff related to women and gender. So I'm reading about Igbo women and African women in particular. But I'm also excited and interested on this matter, the 1929 Women's Revolt, because my grandmother, whom I did not meet, but has stories about her, was pregnant with my father when she went to the Women's War. So the story of the Women's War is often told in my own family. Let me begin thanking the organizers of the conference, OFO, for inviting me to give the keynote address. I appreciate their thoughtfulness in making this event an opportunity for the community and academics to come together to celebrate a very remarkable event that brought the people and other Easterners, including feminists, for its role in challenging the British sought to impose on Eastern Nigeria and other colonized societies as part of European modernity and as part of their agenda of uplifting the degraded portion of humanity. The political and economic models that characterize British colonial modernity, including the transformation of agriculture for Eastern Nigeria, the palm produce trade, and political transformations in the case of Eastern Nigeria, the warrior chief system, ran counter to the ideas and ideals of a people whose egalitarian created opportunity for popular participation of men and women, rather than restrict any of the gender. I will begin by addressing a particular conceptual issue, the name by which the revolt or uprising is known. Past records, can you hear me? Go ahead. Yes, sir. Past records have referred to the 1929 Women's Revolt or episode as the Aba Riot, or Aba Women's Revolt, or Aba Women's War. What is the origin of these names, and why do they matter in the larger historical context? First, hello? Okay, saying, Ululaya, Abara, there's Abara in every, most records of the Women's Revolt. And I wanted to, sort of think about what is the origin of the name Aba when you describe the 1929 Women's Revolt. First, the name Aba was carefully chosen by the British colonial authorities first to discredit and limit the spatial extent and the of this popular uprising led by indigenous women against the British, the first in all of sub-Saharan Africa. The term riot also, as the British proclaimed, would suggest disorganized mob engaged in violent public disturbance, often stemming from frustration, oppression, or specific grievance involving property damage, injury, unlike peaceful protest. Riot, the term used by the British, according to British anthropologists, Van Eyck quotes a picture of uncontrolled irrational action involving violence to property or persons or both. A riot neatly removes women from the picture, while the Women's War conveys an action by the women. When the British colonial logic of riot sought to diminish the opposition and the framing of the revolt as a band of unorganized and riotous women engaged in senseless destruction of property and bent on causing disorder, it communicated to London a fundamental challenge to the British colonial policies and the global response to the economic crisis of the 1920s and 1930s, and that is the Great Depression. Indeed, the women's movement of 1929 embodied many of these characteristics. But the Women's War was not an organized riot as the British portrayed. It was not carried out by a group of women in frenzy bent on disturbing the public. I'm going to mention a little bit more as we go on why the framing of the uprising was much more organized than the British sought to portray it. Second is the spatial spread of the revolt. The use of Aba, I think, in many respects, makes mockery of the revolt by localizing its impact and where it took place. I have a problem with the nomenclature. Certainly, some of the most destructive aspects of the revolt took place in Aba, which was a very large commercial center in the colonial period, where women destroyed European factories, broke down prisons, set prisoners free, among other actions. However, the origin of the Women's War was in a small village called Oloko in Bende Division, where the Oloko trio of Ikonia, Wandelia, Monyeroa, among others, provided leadership, and where about 10,000 women from various parts of eastern Nigeria gathered to sit on a British district officer, Captain Hill. Around 50 to 53 women lost their lives, with many more wounded. Significant casualties occurred in Utu-Itin, Eko, where around 18 women were killed, and Ekot Abbas, where 31 women and 1 man were killed. These were the areas where the violence of colonial forces and the violence of colonialism was in full display. My preference is to refer to the uprising as Ogo Wine or the Women's War, as the women themselves characterized and referred to it. Another conceptual issue is the violence of colonialism. The pacification of the so-called primitive societies as part of the white man's body was a very violent process. This scholarship has shown the extent to which European colonial forces committed mass atrocities and genocide in the process of colonialism. Examples abound. The Germans committed violence and genocide against the Herero and Nama people of today's Namibia. It is recorded that in what is today the Congo, 10 million people died under the Belgian rule in the Congo. The British exterminated a lot of the Kikuyu in what is today Kenya. The killing of unarmed women protesters by colonial forces during the 1929 Women's Revolt has not received the sort of attention it deserves in terms of its role or part of colonial violence. I think I wanted to point to those two issues because as a historian, it's critical to think about this in the larger scheme of historical narrative. Let me emphasize of interest, perhaps, which many have ignored. When we think about the Women's War, we think about tax, but we don't emphasize how the tax is related to the larger political economy of the Igbo people, particularly how tax is related to the production of palm oil for cash, the so-called cash crops, and how this was critical in how the women framed or movement. One, that it's important to think that understanding exactly that opposition to agricultural regulations and colonial taxations, land alienation, were major sources of rural resistance throughout the colonial period in Africa. However, unlike the settler colonies in East Africa or Southern Africa, where issues of land and labor dominated indigenous struggles, West Africa, was faced with sort of a different, problem. Those problems include market regulations and price control. Historians highly claim that in the African context, the poor sectors of the population are much less aware of their exploitation and than their counterparts in Asia and Latin America. This view can be contested in the case of Nigeria, particularly understanding how women responded to the British in Eastern Nigeria in 1929. The women in Eastern Nigeria was then, and they did something about it. Why the early protest movements in many parts of Africa involved men, in the case of Eastern Nigeria, they were dominated by women. The acts of resistance carried out by women in Eastern Nigeria were different from those that Scots described as everyday forms of resistance. Scott's Malaysia example, he argued that everyday forms of resistance makes no headlines. This quiet and anonymous, whether or pleasant action is confined to the backstage of village life, unquote. However, we see that those were different from the case of women in Eastern Nigeria. I want to emphasize first that before the 1929 revolt, there were other sporadic protests related directly to the local economy in this part of the world. Some of those were related to introduction of produce inspection, the new government, along with the drop in prices. Women in 1926 objected to the method of buying produce by weight, which replaced buying by measure. As a means to increase the quality of produce, colonial administrations also introduced produce inspection in 1928. Local producers have been responding to the agricultural problem by sometimes adulterating produce, in some cases by adding water to the oil to increase the quantity. In Ngwa region, peasants mixed water with palm oil to increase the weight of palm kernel. Producers left palm kernels partially cracked, sometimes leaving part of the kernel with a shell to increase its weight. These were subtle ways through which local people sought to address the conditions they faced as a result of European intervention in the local economy. In 1929, the value of palm produce had the ability of many men to meet their tax obligation to the colonial states increased the burden on women, who often pay taxes for their sons or spouses. According to Wanyerowa, in her testimony to the above commission of inquiry, some of those who could not afford to pay borrow money from their wives in order to pay their taxes. Others borrowed money elsewhere at 100% interest. For instance, if they ask for a loan of 5 shillings, they promise 5 shillings interest, bringing the amount to 10 shillings. In these accounts, women are seen as directly supporting the colonial state, while their role in the household subsidized their families. But by the 1920s, they were having increasing difficulty meeting these obligations. So, what I want to emphasize is that in Igbo land, women protested for both economic and social reasons. But the major discontent resulted from the crisis in the agricultural economy, holding of palm produce to force increases in price. I want to emphasize this because when we think about the women's revolt as tax, we're not linking that greatly to the nature of the economy and the crisis that we were already facing, right? Selling palm oil. If you are selling your palm oil at 50 shillings a gallon, by 1929, the price had come to 70% off, right? 5 shillings. So the crisis was real for many women. But the led of Oloko Bende division to start a protest that spread throughout Igbo land and Ibibio land. The revolt was sparked by a dispute between a woman called Wanyerowa and a man called Mark Emerowa, who was helping to make census of the people living in the town of Oloko under the Warren Chief of Hugo. The Warren Chief system, or how this problem started. In 1929, a new DO was appointed for Oloko. Captain Hill felt that the nominal role of Oloko was not comprehensive enough because it shows the man's name, but it didn't tell how many wives, how many children, how many children in terms of allocated taxes. So, I want to make it very clear. That the process did not indicate initially that women were going to pay tax. The process that Captain Hill started at Oloko indicates that women were going to pay tax. But that the cutting of the household and property or comprehensive idea about the worth of each man. So, on the morning of November 18, Mark, a school teacher who was appointed by the warrant chief Okugo to do the counting in Oloko, arrived at this woman's house. The woman was preparing palm oil. And when Mark arrived, he asked 1 year he wants to count the number of children, the number of chicken and goats in the family. 1 year was aware that previously the enumeration exercise that was done was followed by tax on men. There was, I think, in her own thinking, that this time that women are going to be counted will become probably a prelude to taxing women. So, 1 year asked Mark, have you counted your mother? She continued that last year they were doing the counting. After the counting, that the daughter-in-law who was pregnant died in childbirth. Somehow, perhaps in indigenous, ideas and ideology, you don't count women. You don't count women. You don't count pregnant, women as fruit-bearing trees. So, 1 year associated the counting with the death of the husband. I mean the sister, daughter-in-law. And the fracas that began with 1 year and Mark led 1 year to go and beat other women who were beating for a different thing and told them that Ogugo had given directions that women should be counted and that this is going to be for tax. That's how this revolt started at Oloko. And women sent messages throughout Igbo land to gather at Oloko. And by the time they gathered at Oloko, there were 10,000 women or more at Oloko sitting on the depot, whose wife had just arrived from London. If some of you who are familiar with British stuff, they do horse racing. When they do derby, it's like massive number of people. That's the way they describe it, the number of women there. Captain Hill was only saved by his wife coming to speak to the women. The women demanded later that women are not going to be taxed, which Captain Hill wrote. The women demanded that she writes a letter for each village that they're not going to pay taxes on. There's no photocopy, right? So you're going to write a letter for each group of people. Anyway, what I'm trying to emphasize is that this exchange between Wanyawowa and Mark led to the revolt. And women British then was first to depose the native Para chiefs, including Okubo, which they got. Okubo was deposed and his cap taken and sent to jail. But the revolt had much more important implications. There are people who have described it, Gaide, Afibu, and others, as part of any forms of nationalism. There are feminist scholars who have looked at it as women asserting their rights and fighting for women's, rights. My emphasis is that this was not more than a feminist movement. Feminist movement is one where women are fighting specifically for women's rights. But in this case, Igbo women were fighting for the rights of the household system, including the men. So it was much more than a feminist movement. I want to emphasize also that in reality, the matters that gave rise to the conflict was not just in their petition wrote, can you please inform the general agents or merchants that we have to sell palm oil at 10 shillings a tin and 7 shillings for a bushel for palm kernel. And I want to emphasize basically that the profound, let me conclude, the profound historical importance of the protest is not confined to the courageous attempts of the women in Eastern Nigeria to challenge their insecurity and resist their impoverishment under colonialism. These protests were linked to the economic crisis that gripped the region in the 1920s as a result of the Great Depression. The economic pathos in this protest showed the thin line between colonial political and economic policies. The women's revolts also reflected an emerging conflict between local people and the rising middle class of leaders imposed as the warrior chiefs. Certainly, the political was linked to the economic in several ways. However, the report highlights the crisis that emerged in the present economy. Let me make a final point here. The women's war occurred because the new system imposed by the British did not align with the Igbo traditional system, which rejected centralization and loyal dominance of the economic and political spheres of life. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Chima Korieh. You see, every job has its